It is December 7th, 2017. D-Day. I'm going to continue talking about the developing ideas for clients, part 2. So, in the last morning podcast, quick summary, I talked about some recent layouts I've been working on for this Dragon Ball cover. My initial work offer, client idea and direction, step 1. Step 2, reference gathering. Step 3, composition roughies. And step 4, second color pass. Those, I want to slow it down a little bit and get back to talking about this composition and color pass. In comics, I think they call them breakdowns. That's where you're reading the script and you basically break down the script into a page, very very small, usually 1/4 the size of a piece of paper. Like if you take an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper and fold it in fours, you would draw on a square that size. Get a little thumbnail of that, and then you can sort of design 4 pages at a time, and you would send that off to get approved, and then you'd move forward. On cover art, it's different, like especially for magazines and trade paperbacks and anything where the image is really designed to tell the entire. It's less story related and more like poster driven. Feels more like poster work. So when you're laying down compositions, doing 3 or 4 solid layouts wouldn't be any different than doing 4 breakdowns, except a breakdown, 4 options for one cover layout, because art directors and editors, they're always going to want to mix and match. They are always, and you want them to feel like they have a creative, I don't want to say input, but they have a creative part. Like they're helping you to create the thing that they want, but they're, how do I say that? It's one of the many reasons why I started doing this, is to put some of this process like into words. You want to feel like they are getting what's not just what's in their head, but that they had a part in it. And you got to balance that against just doing whatever the hell they want. Now, when you're just starting out, if you got your first couple jobs and your first opportunities, you ain't gonna have a say in jack shit. Like that's just, unless you're super fucking talented, unless you're like you're the next if you're the next Wendy Penny, I mean if you're the next Alex Ross, or you're the next Therese Nielsen, good luck. You're just gonna have to, and that's good too. Like, but I put a lot of effort in these compositions, and then the second color pass is that point where you take their ideas, merge them together, and then you get to develop the atmosphere of the piece in small color thumbnails. Now, I think the thing to remember too here is not everyone's a colorist, and not every colorist is an illustrator. If you're required to color your own art, you're gonna have to know when to put on the coloring hat and the artist hat, and which strengths to focus on. Now, if you're not a colorist, I do not recommend coloring your art, not for professional work, and that's tough, because you're not gonna get cover art if you can't color your own art these days. unless you're like Joe Mad, or if you've already got a name and a team, that's one thing. But these days they want you to do everything. So at that point, it's you're better off either teaming up with someone and splitting the proceeds, however you want to do it. I always split my work half and half, but I I also expected the colors to make my art better. I mean, my art, I would put everything into the pencils and the colors should enhance it. But if the colors didn't enhance it in some way, then, I wanted 50-50. But that was 10 years ago, and I cannot imagine having to. There's some great colorists out there. I mean, I hang out at when I go to cons or some signings and stuff. You meet some comic artists that have access to some pretty great colors. So it is possible. It is possible. But for me, I don't really get a feeling for my cover art until the second color pass. That's the uh, that's the part where I can relax. Once I get the color down, and even if it's a couple different ways, and I send it back, and sometimes they'll pick none of them and say we're thinking it's a little too dark, a little too bright. Quick tip: 9 times out of 10 on cover art, especially, they don't want mood lighting. You know those really cool lighting schemes where you sort of put half the frame in shadow and just pop out a warm spot? You got to be very careful about that because the if you do that, you can't darken it up too much because they will be like, it's going to print dark and the cover's going to be dark. I've found that generally speaking, with cover art, they don't want realistic lighting schemes. They want it to be seen. So if you draw lots of details, it's helpful. And it also explains why all too often you see cover art kind of have way too many glows and stuff. You ever notice it's kind of like over affected? So I just wanted to really emphasize that composition roughy in the second color pass phase, for me, is where it's like the last bit of serious mental fatigue can set in. It's simple and it's hard, and you can totally be like wanting to give up and hate stuff after that. I've just found that's where you hit the quagmire. Once that gets okayed and you can move on, for me, because I draw, I draw in color, uh, because I see things in details. Once that's done, taking that color roughy, turning the opacity down, a flattened version of it, and drawing the basic construction over that is where the fun begins. That's when I can start streaming, and I work out all the shapes for the characters, and then I put details. That's what I call my roughy lines. So again, that's you take the color roughy, you flatten it, turn the opacity down, and if I'm drawing it digitally, well, I always do the color roughies digitally anyway. So 300 dpi, and then I break down each character into their design shapes, construction shapes. Get that working, get the hands working, get the structure of if they have poofy pants or hair, get all those construction shapes working. And then when that works, turn that opacity down, or add another layer of white at like 95% opacity. And then on top of that, I'll draw the character details. Again, roughy. They're not super clean. I usually use my pencil brush for that part at this point because that's like a halftone effect. And then at that point, when all the whole piece has roughies and roughy lines, I will then send that over again to the client so they can see an update. If that process is taking me a day or two, because there's lots of details, then every day I just send an update. Hey, I'm working on it. And if they have concerns about stuff, I note them, but I don't get too worked up about it. generally they give you the thumbs up. I've only found that it's really novice people, like people you've worked with that have never really done anything professionally. They tend to be like, the face this and the ears that, and I'm like, you know. Now at that point, I had the roughing lines. It's time to do the final line art, and that's going to go one of two ways. I'm either going to print that out and draw it traditionally on I generally draw on 67-pound construction paper. It's a 67-pound cardstock. I use a Staples cheap brand, but it has a nice tooth to it. It's archival. It'll last. They don't yellow. Has a nice weight, and because it has the tooth, when I use Copic multiliners, I like to draw with red pencil lead and ink with Copic multiliners, and I really only I kind of block in those lines, but a lot of times, especially if you have the roughy lines, you don't have to do much blocking in. The only thing I'm really drawing at that point with those kind of cleaned roughy lines is if I have like a big thing like a gun or a robot. Half the time I will just leave it in silhouette and basic construction shapes and finish it on the page because there's so many mechanical details. I don't like getting bogged down in the computer trying to figure that out. It's easier for me to do it on the page. So I'll either draw traditionally on 67-pound cardstock with red lead and mechanical pencil, or I'll ink it digitally. That depends on what the client's looking for. They want something super clean and smooth, and that's 90% of cover art. If there's tons of details, then I will definitely go with the digital inks because I would have to print it out at like the Game Informer cover. If I had done all the details in traditional inks first and scanned it back in, I would have had to print it out at 11 by 17, rotated horizontally, two up. So it would be four of those. It'd be two rotated horizontally, two up per page. It would have been four 11 by 17s to scale it appropriately because of all the game covers and plushies and stuff. So no point in that. And then that just takes time. Like with the Mega Visions, I did issue 5. I did the Berserk cover. That was drawn traditionally because it's one big character. So it's easier with giant things. It's easier to print them out and draw them. With a bunch of smaller things, it's easier to do it digitally. One note to that. I did this Battletoads tribute last year. And the Battletoads are really big, and they're surrounded by tiny little plushies. I found it easier to take my construction roughies, not my roughy lines, just a construction roughie, with work done on the faces a little bit, put a little bit more effort in the faces, print that out, and I drew the Battletoads traditionally in about an hour, scanned that in, and then photoshopped it in, turned the opacity down, and inked it over that. So some of these things, it's just because the size of them. And I get really into construction and the way little folds occur. And so in that case, it was easier to draw those 3 traditionally, scan it in, and then draw the rest digitally and re-ink them digitally. All right. Now that process, again, if it's traditional inks, it can take a full day. Generally, it doesn't take me more than 8 or 10 hours tops. Usually it takes me 4 to 6. Like, it's pretty quick. Digitally can take double that. So if it takes me 6 hours traditional, it's going to take me 12 hours digital to get those smooth, clean inks. Like the PlayStation Magazine style stuff that like Joe Madden did with, was it McWeeny? I think McWeeny's the inker's name. That tends to be the kind of inks that I go for, somewhere between McWeeny and Jeff Smith from Bone, if you all know who those people are. But if you go back to PlayStation Magazine from 95, 96, 97, 98, the Soul Reaver cover, the Resident Evil cover, those were traditionally inked. And then Joe moved into clean pencils with the Street Fighter Alpha 3 cover, which, whatever. But that's how I did the inks for the Game Informer piece, and how I did the inks for Megavisions issue 4 when I did the Wonder Boy with all those characters. I did it like that. But in the case of Megavisions issue 2, for the Yakuza tribute, I drew that traditionally. Now, when you scan the stuff back in with traditional inks, I go into the color phase, right? Well, hold on. When you scan them back in, I draw with red lead and Copic multiliners. I have a process of extracting the red lines from those black inks, which I gotta really make an art tips video on. Let me write that down. Art tips, red pencil extract. So I can take that texture and tone it down or increase it or tint it. I can separate it from the inks. If I drew in just pencil, I couldn't do that. Also, if I inked with the red ink like I do with the color work that I do, if I did that with my traditional lines, I couldn't do that. So, but if I'm inking digitally, then whatever. I just extract the inks, separate them from the white, and then I do my flatting process. Let me take a drink of coffee. This might go into a 3-part. Because I could just say I do my flats and then I move the colors, but that's unfair. Flats aren't fun. Flats aren't fun. They're not fun. But they're important, especially with the way I color. So I have two things. I have selection flats and coloring flats. And selection flats are for selecting individual big areas that I want separated from one another. So each character gets a selection flat, and then sometimes a part of them gets another selection flat, and it's usually bigger chunks. So if I have a character like Wolverine pointing his claws at you, Wolverine will have his own thing, and then inside that I trap that layer, and I'll make like his claws and his forearm, like his claws, his forearm, and the rest of his body, 3 individual colors. Maybe his back arm, another one, just for airbrushing, so I can just select those areas. I found it's pretty important to not overdo the selection flats. Each character should be on their own layer, maybe 1 to 3 colors of separation, and those colors need to be ugly colors like neons, so that they can just be selected quickly. When all the selection flats are done, I then do the coloring flats, and that's where you fill in the characters with their base color. So Wolverine has blue or gold or brown or orange, the hair, the skin tones. And I try to unify a lot of those colors, so I don't have a lot of fluctuation in reds. I have like one red for the piece, or one kind of blue, or a light blue and a dark blue. I keep those colors unified for that piece. And again, that's all based off what I did in the color roughy. If you have that color roughy, getting to the colors, like by the time you're doing the color, you're on autopilot. You don't have to think of a lighting scheme and how to make something work. And I mean, that used to be a real problem of mine when I first started coloring my own work. Was I would draw this stuff, go into Photoshop, and be like, I don't know what to do. How do I make this work? Well, it's so big. I don't. Also, I know in the color roughy phase, if I have a lot of magical effects, I don't have to draw that stuff. I'm going to do that digitally. A lot of times, if I have those magical effects on adjustment layers, layers with like layer properties like glows and stuff, I can just drag those back into my comp at this point, my colored piece, and use it as is or clean it up or go right over it. So a lot of those elements, gradient maps, layer property effects, can be dragged in to your final piece. And then I color it. Coloring should take you half the time it took you to draw something. So tops, no more than that. If you took 12 hours to draw something, it should take you 6 to 8 hours to color it. You know, minus the flats. The flats can eat up however much time they eat up. And then I sit on it overnight if possible. Once I get the colors done, I like to step away, sleep, wake up, make my own edits, and then I'll send it for approval. And if they need tweaks, we make the tweaks afterward. If your clients ever want color changes, just use gradient maps to make the color changes. That's where your selection flats and your coloring flats, you can quickly select areas with that and then create a gradient map and mask it out and make the changes in gradient maps. Now, once you're done and you send the files and you send an invoice, here's where the fun begins. If this is licensed art, I would just, it's 50-50 on this. Be prepared that a week later, even though they had to have it on, say, the 1st, just be prepared that a week later you could get notes where the licensor wants a bunch of changes. Because I've been experiencing over the last couple of years that no matter how many updates I send, those updates never make it to the licensor until I'm complete, and then I have to make changes. And I've charged for those changes, and they have never paid for them. No publisher has paid for those changes. They just send you the money for the initial agreement. What are you going to do about that? In one case, I had a licensor that was from Japan, didn't give notes back until a year later. A year. So, and then when you're done, you complain and you vow you'll never work on this shit again, and you'll make a podcast where you outline this whole process and get yourself all depressed before you go to work. You know. Then you wait a year, and they get back to you and say, "Hey, let's do another cover," and you think maybe they learned their lesson. And they haven't, and you start it over again. So, there's always a cynical way to look at it. But the process, that's how I am. This whole process is how it is now. I've used Trello over the last year to kind of like log these steps for myself, and they have very little fluctuation. So when it comes to cover art, this is how it goes for every client at this point. 98% accuracy to this process. And that's that, folks. It is December 7th, Thursday, 2017, and it's time to go to work.